All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me fine, and hopefully you can see the slides. If not, please, let me know, and we'll try to get it taken care of as quick as possible. The biggest thing that we're going to talk about today is the reduction of unnecessary exposure to radiation and the safety protocols and best practices to help keep you safe. So let's get started. These are the learning objectives that we'll be covering today. So we're going to be able to, excuse me, list the sources of radiation that you may encounter in your daily life. You'll be able to recall differences between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, which is one of the most significant take-home points of this discussion. Identify the health risks of ionizing radiation. Identify at least two types of radiation exposure. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the physiology and the let's just say the negative side of this. This is more to be aware of what can happen and how things happen, but we're not going to go into great medical detail today. Another thing that we'll be talking about is recognizing PPE, proper use of PPE, which is provided by your employers. Recall the meaning of ahra. So ahra or ahra, however you like to pronounce it, tomato, tomato. This is the other key aspect that we're going to be talking about today, because these principles that make up ahra are basically the safest and easiest way to remain safe when working around ionizing radiation. We're going to apply risk mitigation techniques, and when you're working around ionizing radiation, and we're going to identify types of reporting and exposure monitoring, again, provided by the employer. So what is radiation, and how might you be exposed? Basically, radiation exists in the world. We're exposed to radiation every day. If you look at this pie chart, you will see that about 50% of the radiation on the pie chart is represented by medical exposure. So for safety and principle, like for simplicity, let's say that if you had zero radiographic procedures or medical imaging type procedures, you would essentially have 50% less radiation exposure than a person that did have medical examinations. In the US, the average is 260 millirem, or 6.2, I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards, 620 millirem, or 6.2 millisieverts. There's a bunch of different ways of measuring radiation. You will hear terms REM and rad and sieverts. Basically, the United States, we typically use REM or millirem. We want to be in a millirem spectrum. If we're starting to talk about REM, we're getting up into like therapy type doses. So that would be a very bad thing. If you look at the graph again, you'll see that on the green side, in the background side, radon and thoron make up about 37% of our exposure. So now the thing about that is some people are very familiar with radon. Some people have never heard of radon. The reason for that is radon is a naturally occurring radio isotope that exists in the earth, and some places have much more of it than others. So where I'm originally from in Wisconsin, we have large amounts of radon, and it's very common to have what are actually called radon vents in your house, essentially because we have basements in Wisconsin and we excavate into the earth. Basically, that's how radon gas can get into our homes, and it creates a chronic exposure situation where people have been exposed to it, for decades. So now what they do is they actually put a venting system into the liquid drainage system, so that as gas percolates through the ground and the water, instead of coming into the foundation, it's actually just vented outside. So again, to keep it all in perspective, we've been being irradiated on a daily basis all of our lives. We spend time out in the sun, we get irradiated from the sun. Um, we all know that sunburn and too much sun exposure, lack of sun protection, can lead to skin damage and health concerns. And to be honest, the radiation exposures that we're going to be talking about follow those exact same principles and lines. So understanding radiation exposure requires the understanding of electromagnetic energy. And if you simply go out and Google or go jump onto Wikipedia, what you're going to see is this explanation of electromagnetic energy or electromagnetic radiation. They're used interchangeably. There is a slight difference, but we're going to talk about electromagnetic radiation or what's called EMR. You'll see the abbreviation. You'll hear the abbreviation a lot. So basically, what it is as a magnetic field is propagated, there is a push of energy through that field, and when particles are accelerated by that, that becomes electromagnetic energy, and the particles themselves actually become the electromagnetic radiation. It exists on a spectrum. So we talk about the electromagnetic spectrum as being everything from very long, low amplitude radio waves to very high amplitude, powerful radiation types like gamma radiation. And we have all these things in between. The irony is that there's like a minuscule little sliver in this gigantic spectrum that we can actually see, and that is light. So the light that we have every day from the sun, or when we flip on a light switch, that spectrum of light is in the electromagnetic spectrum. It's about 2/3 from left to right. And basically, the more you move from left to right, the more intensity and the more likelihood of radiation exposure and damage occur. So radio waves, although they technically fall within this spectrum, they are non-harmful to us because they are very low energy. They don't have the ability to actually penetrate into a cell to cause damage. And that's essentially what we're talking about, is that energy volume that the particles have to actually interact with cells to cause damage. So another good example is radiant heat. We can't see the heat, but we can feel the heat. I have heard about people that if they stand too close to radio transmitters, they can technically say they can feel some heat from that. Whether that's true or not, I honestly don't know. But basically, radio waves we say are non-penetrating. We say they're non-dangerous because of the fact that they do not carry enough energy to be able to damage a cell. And then if you look all the way to the right, you see Hulk, which is the gamma radiation. And, nobody wants to be the Hulk. Well, I shouldn't say nobody wants to be the Hulk, but nobody wants to look like the Hulk. So, the higher and the more intensity that there is within the radiation, the more we need to minimize our exposure to it, the more we need to take proper precautions. And again, that's what we're really going to be covering. So ionizing radiation, the term ionizing gets thrown around. Very few, well, I shouldn't say very few, a lot of people really don't understand what it means. For all of those people that didn't love chemistry, basically, when we ionize something, what we're doing is we're making an unbalanced electrical valence structure to an atom or a molecule. And if we, talk about it in the sense of what the picture shows, we have an X-ray photon. When we produce X-ray radiation, we have these particles called photons. The photon themselves is not radioactive. What causes the radioactivity is the energy that that photon has. So if that photon, when I'm getting X-rayed, I'm having a chest X-ray done, if one of the gazillion photons that are produced happens to hit an electron in one of my cells, it has the ability to eject that electron. And when it does that, it physically changes the atomic makeup of that atom. If that happens in DNA, you have now created an alternate type of DNA that was not what was originally there. The reason this is significant is because cells replicate. So ionizing radiation is any type of radiation that has enough energy that a particle from that source can cause the ejection of at least one electron from a cellular structure. Once you've done that, you've altered it. That alteration then has the potential to cause health effects. So every time I start talking about this, I start to realize that it sounds like doom and gloom. I don't ever mean it to sound that way. I've worked in the radiation field since I was 18, and I've experienced it from almost every possible way. I've been a patient. I've had radiographic procedures. I was a technologist. I'm a service personnel. I went to medical school. I've done a lot in the medical field, and the irony is that no matter how much I'm in that environment, I constantly pay attention to my environment and trying to be safe. And the reason for that is because, as you'll see as we go on, these effects become cumulative. So unlike you get a cold, your body makes a defense to it, it fights it off, and then you go on, and then hopefully the next time you get exposed to that same bacteria or virus, your body has a much better chance of being able to fend it off without you getting sick. Okay, radiation doesn't work that way. The effects that radiation create within the body are lifelong consequences. Once damage is created, it cannot be reversed. It can only be dealt with through an elimination process. But we never talk about radiation as like a running scale. Like, how much radiation have you received this year? Well, we talk about that. But what we don't say is over the last 12 months. It's not a running scale that is in any time frame. It's a lifetime exposure. So from the first day that you had your first X-ray until you stop working in a field where you may have occupational exposure, you have to be considering the effects that radiation can have on you. So kind of already touched on this. We have a couple of different types of exposure. One is called chronic. It's what we're most likely to have. It is the slow, random accumulation of radiation exposure, whether that's from being out in the sun too much, playing golf, swimming, all those kinds of things, whether it's from not being safe around radiographic equipment, or whether it's possibly working in a more dangerous environment like nuclear medicine. Now, if you work in nuclear medicine, all the things that I'm saying today have to be like ramped up, like big time. Okay, and I'm not really addressing that because that's kind of its own animal. You have actual true radioactive material in nuclear medicine, or molecular imaging as it's more commonly called now, where you're dealing with true radioactive source, like uranium is, where there's a chunk of something and it's literally just sitting there cooking off radioactive particles naturally. The neat thing about X-rays is that doesn't happen. X-rays don't get spontaneously produced. They get produced through controlled mechanisms. Now, there's an exception. The sun is an exception to that. But in general, what we're saying, what we're talking about from an occupational standpoint is when we produce X-rays, it's a very controlled process. We have to have all the procedures in place to create enough energy, to have the right materials involved, and then to be able to coordinate the function of the energy and the materials to actually produce X-rays. And we're usually talking in like millisecond time frames. So exposures are incredibly short. They're very directed. And in general, if you're not standing there exposing yourself, you will not have much, if any, exposure from X-ray radiation. The other neat thing about that is you can take X-rays all day long on a piece of equipment, and the minute you turn it off, you can go service that without any radioactivity. There's no residual effect. The energy has been dissipated. The particles are dead or gone, or they're really not dead or gone. I'm sorry, they're de-energized. There is no more energy to them, and they're only dangerous when they're energized. So you can go and work on a machine. Now, the other thing, obviously, there's biohazard, but there's no radioactive hazard. So it's kind of unique because we talk about radiation and we tend to think about radiation in the sense more of the spontaneous release of energy. And what we're talking about here is very highly controlled, very hyper-focused, very intentional and purposeful. And by being intentional and purposeful, it gives us the ability to be much safer in our exposure to that. So the second option is acute. Acute radiation is exposure, is like, to be honest, it's the outcome of a nuclear event. If a nuclear bomb goes off, we're going to have acute exposure. If you reached around a brick wall, a leaded brick wall in a hot lab and grabbed a radioactive source, you would have a very low level, but you would have acute exposure. So what acute exposure is a tremendous amount of radiation exposure in a very short period of time. It leads to radiation sickness, or what is now more common called radiation syndrome. And in most cases, it results in death. A real somewhat recent occurrence of this were the employees at Fukushima when the tsunami wave hit Japan and took out one of their nuclear power stations. And, those are the situations that are going to cause an acute exposure. Again, if you're working in nuclear medicine or molecular imaging, there is some occupational potential for this type of exposure. So you will be trained accordingly in that particular field. The production of X-rays, like I had just said, is very controlled and hyper-focused. So what we have is we have a device called an X-ray tube, and in order to produce radiation within that or from that tube, we have to apply a tremendous amount of voltage. We're talking kilovoltage. Usually, radiation is produced at a very low end of 30 or 40 kilovolts to a very high end of about 120 to 125 kilovolts. So we have to have the mechanisms to generate this really high volume and immediate transfer of energy from an electrical standpoint. And then we also need a device to liberate to be made of the materials that can liberate photon energy. And those materials are they make up what's called the anode. So what we're doing is we're essentially slamming this really high voltage into a target anode, and then we're carrying along electrons. And when those electrons impact the anode material, they liberate photons, and those photons come out of the X-ray tube with energy that falls within the X-ray energy spectrum. So again, very, very well controlled, very deliberate, and again, an on and off situation. You're either actively doing it or you're not, and when you're not doing it, there is no radiation being produced. So radiation exposure and then the examples of harm. Now, we know all that we know because we've been doing this for over 100 years. William Conrad Rankine is credited with, developing or realizing, X-rays. And the reason they're called X-rays was because they were unknown. They couldn't be seen, they couldn't be felt, and so they called it X. You know, the unique thing is that many people at that time, in the late 1800s, were experimenting with high voltage cathode ray tubes. Many of them were actually producing X-rays, and they just never knew it. And excuse me, William Conrad Rinkin, lucky or not, knowledgeable, smart, whatever you want to say, is the guy that actually received the Nobel Prize for, for creating or identifying X-ray radiation. What we didn't realize about it was how dangerous it could be. So in the picture that you can see there, you can see the hand from a technologist basically working, the technician in the day. This would have been a person that was assisting the doctor and the patient while they were having procedures done, and they were constantly putting their hands into the X-ray beam. Now, constant exposure is what we're afraid of. That's what can cause damage, and you can see the physical damage to this person's hand, loss of their nail beds, irritated skin, loss of skin, actual bone degradation, which we can't see, but if we could see an X-ray of this person's hand, we would see that. A famous, probably the most famous person out there as far as an example of like what not to do is Mr. Clarence Daly. Daly was a glass blower that worked for the Edison Corporation, and he was one of Thomas Edison's best glass blowers. And because of that, Edison got him involved in the development of X-ray tubes. And what they were doing was they were working on the development of X-ray tubes, and they were working on fluoroscopic X-ray. Now, the difference between an X-ray and fluoroscopic X-ray is standard X-ray is a camera is a great example. You point it, you make one exposure, it happens, and you're done. You have your image. Fluoroscopic X-ray is the admittance of X-ray over a long period of time, and you're able to actually watch it like a video, and you can actually record it like a video. So it is used extensively. Anybody that's ever heard of a heart catheterization or a balloon dilatation or stent placement for somebody that has a blocked coronary artery, these types of procedures all involve fluoroscopic use of X-rays. Okay, so what we're doing is we're not just making a single quick exposure. We're actually turning it on and we're leaving it run, and we're moving the detector around to be able to see what's happening in real time. Very helpful. And we are able to deal with a lot of health related situations because of it, but inherently more dangerous. So when we work in a fluoroscopic environment, we're actually exposed to a lot more radiation. Mr. Daly ended up, losing eventually both of his arms, had a lot of cancerous problems, and ended up dying from radiation-related illness. So with his death, Edison actually was so profoundly affected by it that he kind of saw it as like the devil's work, and he got out of working with X-ray tubes at the time because he only saw what was happening to the people that were on his team that were working on and developing it, and sadly didn't see the flip side to if we did it more safely, what the benefit was going to be for people in the future. Radiologists and the technicians of the day, as we realized that things were happening to people, they started looking at it and implementing safety procedures. And in 1915, the British Rankin Association or Society was the first group that actually formalized safety protocols and treatment protocols so that they could help to start eliminating the staff exposure as well as create safer patient exposures for radiographic procedures. Now, the unique thing about this was at no time did anybody ever say, this is not worth it. It's been one of those things in history where, although we realize that damage and negative side effects occurred, the benefit of it still always outweighed it. So it's been a long learning curve. In 1922, the U.S. adopted the same, basically the same procedures as the British were using, and we started creating radiation safety protocols and safety programs. They also were instrumental in starting to develop a lot of what we now call PPE, the lead-lined gloves that we could use on our hands if we need to put our hand in the exposure area, lead-lined aprons that we can wear to shield us from, extraneous radiation, or what we call scatter radiation, as well as goggles and all kinds of other things. So a lot of safety protocols and PPE came out of this process of working with it and realizing what's happening over time. It's kind of the insidious aspect of radiation sickness, is that especially chronic exposure takes years. So it's not the kind of thing that we, one day you will go to bed looking normal and the next day you wake up looking like Clarence Daly. That took him like 15 years or something like that to advance to that stage. And that was working, 10, 12, 14-hour days, often 6 to 7 days a week. So hopefully, our working conditions are much better than that. Minimize and monitoring radiation exposure is a significant aspect of safety. So, what we're going to talk about is how we can take radiographs and do them safely, how we can work on equipment safely, and ALARA is the biggest part of that. So again, ALARA stands for as low as reasonably achievable. Basically, there is no such thing as too low. Too low, a minimal, or I should say the minimum amount of exposure, which would be 0, is the safest place to be. Once you're no longer at 0, you have a risk for danger of being impacted negatively by that exposure. So there are 3 primary components to ALARA, and that is time, distance, and shielding. And if you leave here remembering absolutely nothing except those 3 things, I've been successful in this presentation. Those truly are the most important things that you need to learn and walk out of here today with. So time, the shorter or the less amount of time that you are exposed to radiation, the less amount of damage can occur. Simply stated, the longer you're sitting out in the sun, the longer your skin is exposed, the more likely it is that you will become sunburned. If you think of it that way, it makes perfectly good sense to everybody. Again, X-rays, typically millisecond exposures and very, very highly controlled. So as long as you're not putting yourself within the beam area during the exposure, you are not really going to experience any exposure. But the less time that you are near the device making the radiation, obviously, the safer you are. Distance. So the second principle to me is probably the most important one to use for people that are working while we're producing radiation. Now, as service personnel, we're rarely doing that. If we are making exposures, there's no reason for us to be in the room that we're making the exposures in. So we can actually isolate ourselves. The technologists and the doctors, on the other hand, have to be there for patient care, and the nurses. I don't mean to not include them. They need to be there for patient care purposes. So because the patient is in the room, they need to be in the room sometimes, and because they are in the room, their occupational exposure is always going to be higher. So distance, the thing to remember about distance is we have a thing called an inverse square rule. Basically, as you increase your distance away from the source, you inversely reduce your exposure. So, perfect example, you sit by a fireplace. The closer you sit to the fireplace, the more heat you feel. The further away from the fireplace you sit, the cooler you feel. Okay? It's the same effect. It's just that we're talking about a feeling versus an actual exposure that we cannot sense. The perfect way to envision this is this little diagram. So if you are 1 foot away from an X-ray tube when you make an exposure, we're going to say your exposure is 4R. If you simply move 1 foot backwards from that position, you're now 2 feet away from the tube, and your exposure is going to be 1R. If you move 2 more feet and you get 4 feet away from the X-ray tube, you're now at 0.25R. So the general rule of thumb is to be 6 feet away from an X-ray tube when it makes an exposure. Everybody's got a roughly, and again, excuse me for everybody, but if you stick your arms out, most people have between a 5 and 6 foot arm span. Okay, if you simply use that as a quick guide and measure, you will be able to quickly say you're 6 feet away from an X-ray tube. Okay. If for some reason you need to be in an X-ray room while you're producing X-ray radiation, you should be at least 6 feet away, if not further. If you can be further away, you should be. There are very rare circumstances where sometimes we have to hold a device with a meter on it or something like that because we don't have a proper way to support it or do something else. In that case, we should be using sticks or brackets or something, and we should be at least 6 feet away from the tube. The last thing is shielding. Lead is the most common shielding material. Lead has a very high density and it has a higher atomic number. This is why it has the density that it does. The density is the thing that actually stops the energy of the photon from being able to penetrate it. So the amount of energy that a photon needs to penetrate a lead vest is typically higher than what we would be producing at the maximum output of the X-ray. Now, there's sometimes that's not necessarily true, but in general, if you think of it that you're putting that vest on, it's essentially like a Kevlar vest to a bullet, okay? It's going to absorb all the energy of that photon and it's not going to reach your skin. And as long as it doesn't reach your skin, you haven't been impacted by the energy of the X-ray beam. So lead is our go-to thing. It's malleable, it's flexible. We have it rubberized and we have it stitched into material and all kinds of other types of gadgetry. We can have leaded glass. That's what the leaded goggles and glasses are made of, that sometimes you will see specialists using, like especially in cardiovascular labs and things like that, where there's a lot of radiation used. Another thing is leaded glass is used in the syringe holders for some of the nuclear medicine radioisotopes that are injected, because the technologists need to be able to monitor how much medication or radioisotope they're giving. They need to be able to see the plunger movement. So because of that, they actually use leaded glass for those holders. Lead will stop gamma radiation. It just takes a lot more of it because it is a significantly more powerful particle. So when you're in nuclear medicine or molecular imaging, and if you ever have the opportunity to look at any of their equipment or be around any of their equipment, you will notice that it is usually pretty ginormous. And the reason for that is because there's a lot more lead in everything. They use solid lead bricks as to build little walls to actually draw up their radiopharmaceuticals and things like that. So, you know, in X-ray environments, you will have the flexible and malleable type of lead ware. You won't need to have lead bricks or anything like that because the energy is just not that high. X-ray beam. So if for some reason say you're doing calibrations on an X-ray room and you have to put a phantom in the field and make an exposure of that phantom. Well, when you do that, you should use what's called the collimator. And the collimator is the square or rectangular box underneath the tube, and it has movable lead blades inside of it. And what it does is it basically is designed so that you do not make an exposure of an area greater than what is necessary and useful. So if you're going to put your hand down on an X-ray film and make a hand exposure, you're not going to put your hand down on a big 2-foot by 2-foot square right in the middle and make an exposure. You're going to put your hand way off to one side, and then they're going to collimate down so that the field that's going to be exposed is no bigger than the hand itself. And the reason for that is we don't want any extra radiation going somewhere where it's not going to be useful. If the radiation doesn't have a useful point, there's no reason in that radiation to go to that area. If we're not going to actually be able to create imaging of that area, there's no reason for the radiation to be there. That in itself makes us safer, and it makes it much safer for the patient as well. So, oops, excuse me, sorry about that. So we talk about what's called collimating, or sometimes you'll hear referred to as coning. Basically, there's a lot of different techniques for doing this, but the one I explained with a collimator and blades that move perpendicular to each other will be able to create any kind and size shape of box, rectangle, square, you know, that you need to be able to image the part. And again, if you're putting a phantom down, you should be collimating down to the size of the phantom. You shouldn't be having the exposure wide open unless the procedure tells you that that is exactly what is required. There are a few systems and a few types of calibrations that do require the collimator to be completely open, but then there's absolutely no reason for you to be in the room while you're making that exposure, because you're essentially just pointing the X-ray beam at something and it's unrestricted in any way. So again, the best place for anyone is to be outside the room. If you can't be outside the room, then you need to take the safety precautions of the proximity to the X-ray source, the time that you're exposed to the X-ray source, and to use shielding if you're going to be exposed to an X-ray source. And again, that's what makes up ahra. So what's called scatter radiation. This is probably the worst part of X-raying somebody, is that when the radiation passes through their anatomy and interacts with their makeup, that energy can be scattered. And scattered radiation is far more dangerous because it is a lower energy level. So if it's, you know, has a certain energy level when it goes into the patient's body, it comes out of the patient's body in an unattended direction. It's lost a lot of its energy, but it may still have enough energy to be able to penetrate into a person standing nearby if they're not properly shielded. So this is much more relevant to technologists and medical personnel that are in the room during exams. Again, from a service standpoint, there's really no significant reason for us to need to worry about this. But I do mention it because you will hear about scatter radiation. It's probably one of the more misunderstood parts of radiation awareness in the field. Also, PPE. Then, you know, we all have radiation monitoring badges, or at least we should. You should not be working in a radiation environment without one. It is your employer's responsibility to provide you these. There are a variety of different companies and a variety of different types. Some of them are fully electronic. We're now to Bluetooth devices that record our exposure levels and automatically transmit that information on a scheduled process or on demand to either a cell phone app or a computer app that will be running in the background to essentially harvest and collect it. The older style were actually little strips of film that had different types of filtration over the top of them, and that film slowly became exposed. And then they would extract that, develop it, and compare it to scales and do readings on it. Those still exist and they are still used, but I see far more of the electronic devices, either Bluetooth or USB. I'm sorry, yeah, Bluetooth or USB, being Bluetooth or the newer style. The one that you see pictured here with Ben's name on it is a Bluetooth style from Instadose. These readings are collected and maintained by your employer, and you have the right to ask at any time for a report. Now, if you have the app on your phone, you can go in and you can look and see what your exposure recordings are. But you know, one of the things, and it happens universally in the industry, is when you leave one employer and go to another employer, you leave your old badge and information with the employer that you left. You go to a new employer and you start new. And again, this is cumulative. So, you know, people that are really sensitive about this information will actually get a printout from their previous employer showing what their combined lifetime dose at that institution was, because it has to be maintained as part of your employment record. So at any time you can, in writing, request that from your previous employers or previous locations of employment, and whether it be a hospital or a third-party service organization or OEM, it doesn't matter. They all maintain the records the same way, and by law are required to be able to provide that data to you. Ports are basically what I was just talking about. Minimally, you're supposed to get an update once a year. Again, what happens most often is that you have access to the data. So because you have access to the data, the employer is not responsible for issuing you an annual report, because essentially you have access to the information. You can go and look at it anytime you want. I do know a few places that actually do this, and I think it is valuable. A lot of times, again, from a service perspective, not so much, but from a medical employee standpoint, it's monitored much more closely. You can actually be made to go outside of some rotations because your dose level might be getting too high. So if you're working in, you know, a catheterization lab for too long and your dose level starts to get too high, they may take you out and have you work general x-ray for a couple of weeks or something like that, just to help give your body a break and allow your body to try to make up for the damage that may be being caused. All right, so key takeaways. Again, basically addressing what we looked at as the key things that you were going to learn today. How to responsibly work around ionizing radiation, being able to identify types of ionizing radiation, you know, what ahra means, what types of sources produce radiation, the significance of X-ray being like an on and off type of exposure versus an auto propagating and basically self-sustaining emission of radioactivity. You know, again, X-ray, we don't have that. We don't have to worry about it. So everything that uses X-ray radiation falls within that scope. So everything from mammography, CT, cardiovascular and angiography, general X-ray, fluoroscopy, surgeries, procedures where they're using mobile C-arms or mobile X-ray units, you know, all of those types are all standard X-ray production. Ultrasound obviously is non-X-ray producing. It's not radioactive in any way, shape, or form. It uses sound waves. MRI is magnetic resonance imaging. Again, it's using a magnetic field and radio waves, so there's no radiation emitted there. And then nuclear medicine or molecular imaging is kind of the one-off because they actually do use radioactive isotopes that are self-propagating. So they have a material in them that will literally produce radiation until it depletes itself. And they are the one exception. And again, there's a lot of additional training that goes along with working with nuclear medicine, whether it be servicing their equipment or working as obviously a medical technician or technologist in that environment. PPE, what are the proper types of PPE and dosimetry? We talked about flexible lead, wearing aprons if you need to be in the room. We talked about wearing a dosimetry badge, which is again required, provided by your employer. Again, vests and flexible lead, those types of things should be provided by the site. If you're working on an x-ray room, those pieces of protection should be readily available to you. We tend to use them quite often. We may have to cover an x-ray tube to drive the temperature of the tube up. And one of the easiest ways to do that is you take a lead apron and lay it over the x-ray tube and try shooting through the lead. And by doing that, you basically create very high level exposures, which generate a ton of heat. So it's useful in that respect as well as being safe for you. Requirements for record keeping. Again, because you wear a dosimetry badge, those records are kept. You have the right to request those records. You can do that at any time. It is done in writing. So once, I believe that most states have a 30-day moratorium that you have 30 days from the date of a letter being received requesting that information to be able to provide that information back to the requesting person. The last thing is just really being aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it. You are responsible for your safety as well as the safety of anyone else that may be around while you're working on this equipment. So if you're the person making exposures, you have the ultimate level of responsibility because you're the one that's actually releasing the X-ray energy when you make the exposure. You do not have the right to put yourself in the beam. You do not have the right to put anyone else in the beam. You do not have a right to put anything other than test equipment essentially within the beam that you are making an exposure for. That is, service personnel used to do it a lot, and I never understood it. Was they would stick their hand in and make an exposure of their hand. It is actually illegal to do that. And I just want you to be aware of it because it sounds simple and it sounds like, oh, well, one time he can hurt me or something like that. But actually it is dangerous and it is illegal technically to do. I would hate to see somebody lose their job because of something as preventable as that. The other thing is I didn't do my job obviously teaching you very well if you do something like that. So questions and concerns, anything that people have that I did not cover or address?